All right, so we're live. Thanks everybody for joining us. This is the first online Project Codex meetup ever, so it's a pretty special occasion. I hope everybody's doing well out there and has enough toilet paper and tacos and all that stuff to survive the pandemic that's going on. But enough about that. Steve is joining us tonight, so Steve, if you want to introduce yourself. Awesome. So really excited for this topic because I know that there's not only a lot of startups in Orlando and I'm sure around the world, um, but that's a lot of junior developers and mid-level and senior and so on are all kind of working at these startups. And maybe you come from enterprise and you've always wondered what it's like to be at a startup, or maybe that's your first job. So I know it could be pretty startlingly different from maybe what you traditionally would work with. So really excited to get this thing started. Yeah, let's do it.
Kind of alone. They're based off of my experiences. So, your mileage will definitely vary. Kick you guys over to the presentation here. Make sure that you guys can see that. Cool. Neato. So what is a startup exactly? Startup is a small group of people who are kind of working together to solve a unique problem and do it with a unique solution. There's not much money there. There's not any guarantee of success that comes along with that. You would see this as a young business that doesn't have much in the way of any structure or profitability or a core business model quite yet. And so that's kind of the way that I view a startup. Startups don't have to be like these lean, mean, aggressive, machines. They also don't have to be, the big companies of the world. And that kind of gets into what a startup isn't. I view a startup as being kind of like that younger company that doesn't have a lot of formal vision around what they're building yet. They don't have a ton of organization within their company. Whereas you get into more of an established business or a larger business when you start growing, going through more rounds of funding, getting profitable. They know who they're selling to. They know what kind of business that they are. At that point, it's not so much a startup anymore. What also isn't a startup is that cool company that's down the road that has all those awesome perks in the sweet office. A lot of people will attribute those types of traits to startups, but those aren't necessarily things that come along with every startup. And also, usually those things cost a lot of money. So that's usually when startups have become more successful and are now journeying into their next phases of larger companies. So if you have a desire to work for one of these companies, one of the biggest things is how do you get noticed? How do you interview? How do you even know that there's a job available for startups? And what are they looking for? And what are you looking for? So early on in your career, if you're wanting to join a startup, chances are that you're going to want to look for jobs where you're the most proficient in. So as an iOS engineer, I would probably stick simply with trying to find startups that are looking for somebody to come in as a mobile engineer. Also, if I'm usually younger in my career and this doesn't necessarily phase out, where can I learn the most? So who's got an awesome team of really great senior engineers or people that I can spend a lot of time with and hopefully pull from? Earlier in your career too, it may not make the most sense to take a lot of risk with the startup. So joining as like one of the first few members of the founding team for a startup, or joining early angels seeded company. Job security is kind of important when you're younger, and it gives you a little bit more breathing room as far as, the ability to focus on your job and not so much worry about, is the company going to be a company in 6 months. Later on in your career, I kind of feel like you can start following your passions a little bit more. So when you've honed your skills and you know what you bring to a team, then you can start kind of shifting towards, what kind of a company do I want to work for? What's the problem? What's the biggest problem set that they're trying to solve that I would like to contribute to? Oftentimes you'll get afforded the ability to try something new. I've seen people basically come in, they have a great skill set as an engineer and get thrown towards, an area that they may have never really spent a whole lot of time in. Say you're a mobile engineer and you have some C++ skills that you build up in your background, and you've always wanted to take a whack at doing embedded engineering. You can see a lot of times people get pulled in or get pulled from a role inside the company to a new role in the company that allows them to try something new. Also, you might want to try to find a place where you're able to actually hone out some of your non-engineering skills. So if you're a really great engineer, but you haven't taken that step towards being a lead, or the ability to build out a team or build out your first project as almost like as your own project manager or your own product manager, you'll get that ability a lot of times in startups, especially later on in your career where there's a lot more trust in what you're bringing to the team. Who are startups looking for? So this is well founded on kind of my experience over the last 10 years. Early on seed or angel funded startups are really looking for senior engineers. They're looking for people who are subject matter experts. And it's not that they don't want to take on somebody that isn't, well-versed, or is a go-getter and needs room to kind of grow. It's just tough when you have a very limited amount of money that you're working with. And also you kind of are looking for the people who have that experience to be able to kind of dig their own butt out of the grounds when something major happens, or if you are experiencing a problem as a team. It's helpful to have engineers who are not only knowledgeable in their own field or in their own expertise, but also able to kind of swing in and help other people to try to narrow down bugs or solve major issues or conquer, a major problem together. These are also people early on who are very committed to the vision of the company. They're really looking for people who share that same common desire to fulfill the problem that they're trying to solve, and to try to build a team of people who are all committed to that same vision. And also the ability to wear multiple hats. That kind of digs back into what I was talking about with being able to kind of pull yourself out of a situation on your own. The ability to jump in, and if something needs to get done, help somebody else out with what they're working on. So whether that's, you being a mobile engineer, helping the web guys stand up a portion of their RESTful API because you know just as much as they do as far as what needs to be built. Later on in companies, once you get past that post-Series A and you start having that money to start hiring on more people, and you have product that's already in market, at this point, it's easier to start bringing on those mid-level or even junior engineers in some cases, or graphic designers. Same goes, really, what you're trying to do is you're trying to actually prove out that you can bring on junior engineers and mid-levels who can show either skill in what they've built in the past, their experience as an engineer already, and the passion to continue to want to learn more, and the passion about what your company is doing and building. And so they're not necessarily looking for experts here, but they're looking for people who know, at least enough about their particular expertise that if you leave them on their own for a day or two, they're not going to be completely lost. So if you're in the position now where you've maybe narrowed down the right company that you want to apply to, and you found the cool startup that, is solving that problem that you really want to dig into and help solve, it's your job to stand out essentially at this point from everybody else. One thing that I do is I create a unique resume for every company that I've ever applied to. It helps to make it, it helps me to kind of wrap my head around during the entire interview process. Like, is this somebody I want to work for? Like, it forces me to go through that commitment phase with them early on to say, like, I'm putting in this much effort because I really want this job. And it shows too when you're the hiring manager that's receiving that resume. Try not to be boring with your resume either. Get very creative. Don't be afraid to throw templates, like to look up cool templates online or to dig into Photoshop and to like really get creative with your resume. On my resume is like even less than one page. It's like 2/3 of one page. The left side is just like my name, my contact information, my skills as far as like what languages I know and what other technologies that I use day to day, and also just information about me and like what I'm passionate about. So it has like things like traveling and running and doing streaming on there. And then everything else digs into like my past experiences, and I'm not spending a lot of time writing a book about them. I'm literally detailing the information on my resume that I know that hiring manager is going to care about because it was in their job rec. It's what they're looking for. So I make sure that I'm bubbling that information to the top for each of these jobs so that when they come across my resume, they're seeing somebody that is showing skills in exactly what they're looking for. It helps them narrow it down a lot faster. There's a really, 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 really awesome article on this written by Matt Dupree, who's a local engineer here in the Orlando area, regarding his latest job hunt and making resumes that are kind of tailored to the job that you want to get. And also he digs into the interview process and a whole bunch of other stuff that's really fascinating to kind of look into. So when I share these slides, make sure you guys check out that article. It's really great. Another way of doing this too is just kind of forge a unique path. So startups are very weird things, which I'll get into, but my first job that I got in Orlando was literally by tweeting the CEO of the company because that was the medium in which he communicated the most outwardly from the company. So I figured that was my easiest way in, and it happened to be then. Finding non-traditional paths will find openings in startups that may not even be listed. So reaching out to that CEO about maybe a position that you were interested in originally on the website, or just asking, hey, you guys looking for anybody, is sometimes like a really easy way to kind of get your foot in the door. And it also helps drive that top-down approach to the job where instead of having your resume amongst 50, you have a CEO potentially going to a hiring manager saying, hey, check out this guy. So let's say that your resume got picked up, you've passed probably some prerequisite phone screen, you've talked to a few of the people on the team. This is a good time to realize that hiring isn't going to be the same anywhere. So kind of get ahead of this and ask what's expected of the process. If they don't want to disclose, what that process is, then it's probably actually not going to be a very good fit for you as a job. If you're not comfortable going into the interviewing process, it's not a situation I think that's going to be good for you on the other side. You want to, when you show up on that day of that interview, you should feel like you're welcome there and that it's a place that you want to be at. Interviews are also sometimes really weird. I've done very formal beanbag interviews with people who've come in wearing suits for a job that I was wearing camo shorts and a t-shirt, and we were literally doing an interview on a beanbag, I think, while other people were playing Smash Brothers. So it's obviously startups are a different world, and interviews you should expect are going to be different from place to place. Some places might whiteboard you and do a very traditional style. Other places are going to be very loose and just have a conversation with you and build a lot. If they feel like they trust you at the end of that conversation, sometimes that's all that matters to getting a deal. And sometimes you're interviewing for the job that you didn't even apply for. So personal experience from mine, same company where I tweeted the CEO. I was in an interview for a front-end web position. And during that interview, they told me that that position was closed, which felt really awkward that they would still be interviewing me. But then it turned into, well, we feel like you're a good engineer. Would you do this Ruby on Rails sample project over the weekends and submit it to us if you want to? And so at the time, I really wanted to work for the company, and I was willing to kind of do anything at that point to kind of get my foot in the door at a startup. And so I was like, sure, why not? And I apparently killed it enough that I got an email back that was like, do you own an iPhone? And I said, yes. And they were like, great, you're a new iPhone engineer if you want to be. And I'm like, okay, neato. So it's not, when you go into startups, you're not always, sometimes they want you to solve a problem that you didn't realize existed. If you're open to doing different things, this is a really great opportunity and a really great way to actually challenge yourself and to really show from day zero the ability to kind of go out and conquer problems and be able to tackle anything that's thrown at you. The other thing too is during the interviews, relax. I want you to have this job as much as you do. I can't explain to you how much I hate interviewing and hiring. It is like literally my least favorite process to do as a lead or as, somebody that's hiring for a team. It takes a really, really, really long time to find good candidates. And if you're sitting in front of me, that means that you've passed like pretty much all the gates. Right now, I'm looking for you to say the right things. And to say the right things, you need to relax. You need to be able to talk about the things that you've done in the past and talk about them confidently. Nobody's trying to not get you to have the job. That would be a waste of everybody's time. Also know that no isn't always no. Sometimes the first candidate doesn't always work out. And that's not a slight on you. Sometimes two candidates are equal in my opinion, but one is willing to take 15 grand less than the other one. That's a real thing. And so sometimes that first candidate might not work it out. And instead of going through the entire interviewing process, we might reach out to you again and say like, hey, are you still interested in this thing? And if you are, this is yours now. I've seen people that have very successfully done this. I've seen people who have actually turned down jobs and then had the place reach back out to them again later on because they were in need. So just realize that, if you get a no, it's not always no. Maybe ask, hey, what was the difference maker here in this process? And then also realize that the pool's not as deep as you think it is in the Orlando area. It really isn't. When you look at the amount of skilled talent that's in this market, it doesn't go nearly as deep as you might think for the number of companies that are out there hiring and trying to fill positions. So say you passed all these gates and now you've gotten an offer floated your way. Just recognize that in startups, compensation is looked at in many different ways. From your perspective looking in, it's very much should be a cash related scenario in my opinion. The business is going to want you to probably take on a good amount of equity or take on equity in supplement of cash. And at the end of the day, cash pays bills and equity does not always equal cash. A whole presentation can be done on this. I'm going to spend one slide on it. And we're going to talk about options, which is kind of where I've had the most experience so far. Really, the biggest thing here is protect yourself. If you're coming into a business and you've asked for $120,000 as your starting rate, and they want you to take $100,000 and they're going to give you $20,000 worth of equity into the company or whatever that equals out to, recognize that you're not buying equity at that point. They're just saying, hey, if you don't take this money, we're going to give you options, which are the option to buy shares into the company in the future at a price that's basically set now. These options cost you money. So even though you might have left money on the table when you took the job or when you got that offer, you're still going to have to pay for those options most likely when it comes to a point where you will have to execute them, which kind of goes into another part of the territory. If you go to leave the company, most companies have a 30 or a 60-day exercise policy where if you don't buy your options, you lose them. So regardless if you work there for 4 years, you spend all this time vesting up to 100% of your equity in the company, you're tired, you're ready to move on to a new thing, I hope you have the cash to buy those options on the way out, or you really need to try to make a deal to try to prolong and leave them as is. Going back on this slide a little bit, startups are usually not successful, and those options carry a ton of risk to them. So paying, in my case, this is a real example of me, for when I left a startup, I would have had to pay around $16,500 to get 0.25% of the company, which sounds fantastic in a way. It was far under what the investors may have paid, but that company's not successful today. That company is not showing that value. That to me would have been a massive amount of money to have lost on the way out the door. I was able to make a deal to prolong a lot of those options, to hold on to them for a little bit longer, but that's not always the case. And it's definitely going to be on you to make sure that you're the one that's bringing that up and you're the one that's making that deal happen on the way out, because the business is more beneficial to them to allow those options to come back into the business to give to investors at a much higher value later on. The other thing you need to understand too is how much your equity you're actually being offered. Ask for the percentage. A lot of times they're going to go, here's 50,000 options. And that sounds like crazy amount. Like, think about having 50,000 shares in Apple. That sounds amazing. Like, that would be life-changing amounts of money. But it really depends on how many shares there actually are in the company. I know of a person who got 5,000 options inside their offer in a company that had 99 million shares. Like, it was basically, they were worthless essentially to that person. But they, at the same time, they're being asked to forego salary because it's a startup. You know, they didn't ask the right questions of, you know, like what percentage is this? How much am I actually getting out of this? And then if they're not giving you all that, like, do your own math. Like, make sure that you're double checking what's coming across. And the other thing is, get every damn thing in writing. Like, from the start. Startups are weird. Like I said, they're going to do weird things when it comes to hiring a lot of times. And sometimes when it comes to options, it requires board approval to basically allocate those options to you. And sometimes that's not instantaneous. Make sure that when you get that offer, that everything is spelled out in it to a T, that you know exactly how many shares, how many options rather you're getting in the company exactly. Have it in an informal email from the hiring agent if you can. And by agent, I mean just whoever is the one that's basically giving you the offer from that company. They're acting as an agent on behalf of that company. Make sure that you get something in writing that says, this is what the deal was when I came on board. And that's really all I'm going to get into for options and equity. Like, literally, you could do entire presentations on it. And I think that they even may have been done for some of the Orlando Dev talks. But this is definitely an area where you're going to want to protect yourself significantly, because the business has no real obligation to have to do that for you. So if you've accepted an offer and now you're going into your first day at this new startup, first thing you should definitely do, take a picture. Seriously, this is kind of one of the things that I regret not doing from some of my earlier on ones, but younger companies, oftentimes they're working so fast that they don't take pictures anyways either, of kind of where it was at the youth of the company and kind of the cool stuff that you were doing when there was only 5, 6, 15 of you inside a building having fun every day. Make sure that, you know, that first day that you're starting something like that, because it's going to help you to kind of grow attached to that company. Try to meet everybody on the first day. It's not a requirement that you have to learn everybody's names, but try to learn what they do, what team they're on, and, you know, what do they provide for the company? Because that's how you're going to find quickest, you know, which people are the most helpful to you, which people are going to help you solve your problems faster. Go to lunch with your team on the first day and go to their favorite place. They might ask you where you want to go or something like that. Toss it back on them. Say, like, I'd love to go where you guys love to go, because this is going to be a good way of finding out like what the bounds of that job is too. Startups have different rules across the board. Some allow you to have a beer or two at lunch. Some are very much frowned against that. This is a good way to see like what your team does when they're at their favorite place having fun. It disarms them and gives you the ability to kind of like relax a little bit more too, because they're not upset that, you know, they're going to someplace that they really don't like because that's, you know, your first suggestion. You don't know like kind of what their habits are. Get involved with shenanigans too, even right from day one. I think that that's important. I think one of the things that impressed me the most about one of our new hires at one of the startups I worked for was he and I went to the Apple store to go pick him up basically a new computer and all of his setup. And like right from the get-go, he was like, hold on, watch this. We're going to get a discount. And I'm like, okay. I used to work for Apple. And I'm like, okay. Meanwhile, he didn't realize that Apple had updated their employment systems. So he's here trying to explain to this guy, oh, yeah, I totally work for Apple. Oh, yeah, but it's in a different country. Maybe those systems aren't linked. And the guy's like, no, literally, I can look you up. It says that you were a former employee of Apple. And it was like, nice, dude. But the fact that he was willing to jump in on day one and have fun with it and like really kind of be vulnerable actually shows a lot for somebody. So have fun on your first day, like dive into what people are doing. Be willing to kind of put yourself out there, because really these are people that you're going to spend an enormous amount of time with. Being friends from day one is significantly more helpful to you going forward in a startup. Your first week. So this is a good time to start getting a feel for how startups' hours work. Some startups have very, very, very long work weeks, depending on the number of people and what's expected of you at the time. You know, when I was one of the startups I was working for here in Orlando, it was very common for us to work 70-plus-hour weeks early on. There wasn't very many of us, and we were really trying to rush a product to market as fast as possible. But I've worked for other startups where 40 hours is kind of like, if you're working over that, they're kind of asking you like, hey, what's going on? Like, are you in trouble on something? Like, do you need help with something? Like, they're more concerned about it. So get a feel for how your startup works or how the company works and, you know, what's expected of hours. Also see when other people take breaks too. So if it's common for people to bail out, you know, every couple hours to go get coffee or to go play Smash Brothers, play video games with each other, to go chill out, like get involved with that. Don't feel afraid to do that with them. But obviously, you know, make sure that you're not doing that all the time. Nobody expects you to be delivering in the first week, so don't try. You know, like this is a really good opportunity to learn and ask questions and make sure that your setup is good to go and that, you know, you're building the project properly and things like that. It's a lot less important that you are committing code necessarily in the first moment that you join the company. In fact, I would almost rather you're asking me questions about the product and about what we're doing and how you can better position yourself in a week or two to help out. Also, bring donuts on that first Friday. You will win over everybody's heart, I promise you. Just go to Dunkin', pick up a dozen or 2 dozen donuts, maybe a thing of coffee. It won't cost you more than like $25, and you are the hero on Friday. And on your first week, that's a great way to set a very first impression with everybody and to show that, you know, you're in it with them. Your first month. So I've started to kind of split this up now because from this point, early stage, smaller startups where you're more of a founding member is going to be very different from a later stage startup, you know, that's maybe close to its Series A or just past its Series A that's hiring on new people. So that's the way I'm looking at this when I split this up. So on early stage startups, when you're kind of earlier on, it's very likely that you're going to be a single contributor to a brand new code base. So you have the opportunity to kind of blaze your own path here. Moving fast is important, but remember about the people who are going to come after you. It's important to try to set up not only for your sanity later on, you know, well-architected and well-built systems, but also for the people that you might hire or the people that might get hired next to you that have to inherit that system. Identify who your next closest systems and team members are. So if in the case of actually a couple of the startups that I was working for, there were hardware components, web components, and mobile components. You know, identify who those points of contact are in your hardware side and your embedded side and your web side, because these are the people who you're going to work with the most, and these are the people who you're going to need to be able to ask questions to get quick answers from. And talk to those teams about what you're starting to build. Don't be in a silo with that, because if you're in a silo and you're building your own thing, they won't understand it. And it's very likely you might build something that doesn't match with what they're trying to build either. If everybody's in their own silo, it really doesn't work out. And I've seen both inherited projects that were like that, and I've seen projects built that were like that. Later stage, if you're joining as like a mid-level or as a junior engineer, you're likely going to be working with one or more people in the same repository. So it's important for you to be able to get a grasp of where that repository is, what are the major components into it. If you're working with a team that has a few members, do some of those members own certain components within that application? And if so, start figuring out where you fit or where you're going to be the most desired. And then again, same thing goes as an early stage. Start identifying, who your next closest systems and team members are. This is a good opportunity to band up even with the other mid-levels and junior engineers that may have just gotten hired, and to really kind of start building good relationships with them as well. So in your first 3 to 6 months, again, back on early stage, you're a single contributor most likely. You have a very clear idea of the product that you're starting to build now. You've mapped out a clear path. You've worked out milestones, hopefully with the business and goals and where you're going to get there. You've started figuring out builds and how you're going to release those internally, and even possibly externally. You definitely have a grasp on what the rest of the team is doing around you. And you're working hand in hand with those people. It's very important, like I said, to do that. Later stage, if you're, that mid-level junior joining a team in your first 3 to 6 months, at this point, I'm looking at that you're committing code daily to the repository. You might not have gotten a huge piece of the project for yourself yet, but you're actually working your way there and you're showing the confidence at this point. And if you're hitting this point, honestly, as kind of a mid or junior or even early on in a startup, and there's still confidence in you, this is where you're starting to build your equity with the company as far as job security. People are starting to trust you now. People are starting to get an idea of how you work and what you bring to the team. So now you're into the kind of that full year working for a company. Early on, at this point, you're managing your releases internally and possibly even externally. That's going to be largely on you early on in the company. If you haven't passed any, rounds of funding here where you can start growing your team. You have an extreme comfort in describing and communicating your specific work, what you've provided to the company, what you've built at this point, and you should have a pretty good complete understanding of what the rest of the team has built as well, because these systems are systems that you're interacting with on a daily basis. Also, it's not necessarily in there. I think it's in later slides of the company of this, or later slides of this presentation. You're an ambassador of the company at this point, so it's really important that you know what the company does and you're able to describe what the company does, even in a detailed way if asked. If you're that mid-level junior, you're joining a little bit later in the company. Now, hopefully you're working on those larger features that you've wanted to be working on. You're probably also working a little bit more independently. There's probably a little bit less over your shoulder type action that's going on. You know how code reviews work amongst your team. You understand what the expectations are clearly of what you're to be providing. You know what the other teams are working on as well. You don't have to have maybe a fundamental deep knowledge of exactly what they're working on. You're also helping those other teams define the specifications for what they're building as well, hopefully, because you're the one that's interacting with those systems. And at this point, like I, as maybe the lead of that team, I need you to be able to conquer some of that work, because I can't do all that for you at the same time that I'm trying to hire, at the same time that I'm also trying to commit code myself. So it's really important at this point that like at that 6 to 12 month point, I should feel comfortable throwing you basically into a meeting with anybody to talk about your specific part of the project, like the part that your team owns. And that's kind of what I hit on at the end there, is you're able to answer to what your team is working on. And by team, I mean your specific expertise set. Cool. So you're here for a year, along that time, I think like there's a good chance that you felt out whether or not that this is right for you. And kind of along the way, hopefully you've kind of picked up some survival skills of your own. But I almost wish that kind of going into it, I had almost somebody that was like advertising to me like, hey, here's some things that you should keep in mind, during your time at a startup. I learned a lot of these things for myself rather than having a lot, being afforded the opportunity to have somebody kind of explain some of the stuff to me. So over these next few slides, I'm going to just talk about just kind of different survival skills for startups, essentially. The very first one is learning. Work with your other teams and individuals. I've hit on this like a million times already, and I'm going to hit on it like a million more through the rest of this presentation. Understanding their systems means that you can deep dive into their systems, which means that you can help them, which means that they're going to be friendly and help you. Learning what they work on and learning how to help other people around you is going to be exponentially better for the business and for you going forward with the business. Understand, what your startup is and what you do. You're an ambassador of the company. Startups are small companies. It's really up to you to learn how to describe what your company does. It's really important too, because you never know who you're interacting with. You never know when you're going to be thrown into a situation where maybe you're talking to a potential investor and you have no idea. Maybe you're talking to a future customer and you're the person that they're talking to right now. Sometimes it happens to be that way. Sometimes you're at a conference and you're representing the company while the CEO or president is having a meeting with somebody else. That's your time to basically be that person for them at that point. And learn for yourself. Reserve time for furthering your education on things. Build things for yourself. I not only work on iOS apps in my free time, I work on Node.js projects. All the fancy lights that are around me are controlled by a single node server that I have running in my house that I can change in different moods, different themes. If somebody were to donate money to me on Twitch, I can make them do cool green money dances, all sorts of things. I have a little lab table over to the right of me where I do soldering, and I'm working on hardware projects right now. I'm really trying to not only understand like my side of what I do predominantly day to day as an iOS engineer and trying to further that skill set, but I'm also trying to understand what other people on my teams work on as well. I can't explain to you how important it is to like have an engineer who could be handed a board and be like, hey, I don't have from a hardware team, and be like, we don't have time to put this together for you. Can you solder this together yourself? And being able to do that is like, it's hugely beneficial to them. It's beneficial to the business. It's beneficial to you to learn how to do new things as well and to help your other teams. Growing. Pathways to success at startups are not always going to be apparent to you. Moving into new roles sometimes means that you're making that role for yourself. A lot of times in startups, I've had the opportunity to pick my title, essentially. That doesn't happen usually in a larger company. And that will usually sometimes predetermine where you end up later on in that startup's life. So taking on a bigger role and owning it early is sometimes something that's afforded to you in a startup. Make yourself available by working with other teams and working with business and helping with anything that you can. So kind of going back to like what I was saying about learning about how to solder boards together or build up your own boards, or learning how to basically deploy your own little Node.js projects out into the wild. If those are the things that your company works on, that means that you're starting to build up a skill set where you can help other teams and grow yourself and grow the company. And then if you're helping the business and asking where you can get involved, sometimes that means that you're going to get tagged along to go to a conference in place of somebody or for somebody because they don't have the time to do it and they can't split themselves into two. If they trust that you are willing to learn for the company and you're willing to be that ambassador and grow with the company, then they're going to give you a lot more opportunities to represent the company in a lot of different ways. And then, like I said, keep growing at home, keep learning new things, keep pushing. Be patient. Things at startups are really weird. Startups are going to try new things frequently. Keep your head down, recalibrate. It's going to happen often. Reorganization is probably one of those. I've seen pretty much, I think, in the last 10 years of working at startups, probably nothing shy of probably 20 to 25 like reorganizations in some capacity across the board in the lifetime of those startups so far. So that's a real thing that happens at startups constantly. Every few months, don't be surprised if when adding new people on means that somebody's going to get moved over or moved up or even moved underneath people that doesn't make sense. One of the startups I worked for in a 5-person engineering team, I had a director of software, a CTO, and then a CEO in that order for 5 people basically. Didn't really make much sense, but it's one of those things that, you just kind of, you embrace it. You just shrug it off as startups are weird. Be patient, be vocal about where you want to be and what you want to do. And you're going to get that opportunity to move up and to move on to other things. Reorganization isn't always a promotion or a demotion. Sometimes it's just moving you to where you best fit within the company. Or the best team that you might be able to work for. If you're killing it over here with this team and this team's just killing it in general, there's a chance that they're going to move you to a team that's not killing it as much to try to bolster up that team and try to bring some of that mojo that's working here over to there. View that as a good thing. View it as a new challenge. It might not be a promotion. It's usually looked at as, what is this guy going to do? What is this girl going to do in this new position? How are they going to tackle this? And are we going to be able to promote her later or him later into a new role because of what they did? Because they showed that they can go into these teams and really build them up and really, show where their skills are. Have respect for each other. You and your team are in this together, especially when it's small. Literally nobody has it easy around you. You are all in it together. You need each other. And if you fail at this, the business will fail. I've seen small teams go at each other's necks, literally fighting with each other almost on a daily basis. And I know that sometimes it's from being too tired or, working really hard and kind of sometimes that stress builds up on you. But I've seen the nasty sides of this too. I've seen where people are adamant about their engineering and about how great they are and about how it couldn't possibly be their problem. It's your problem. You're the one that needs to go out and fix this. This is your bug. You're pointing fingers. And I've seen just nasty fights fall out from it. And really at the end of the day, it's not helping anybody, because even if it is my own fault and even if it was my mess up, if you're just throwing that in my face and not helping me learn, we're not solving this problem for the business together. We're pulling it down. Even if it's just a day, you pulled that business down by one day. You took one day off the timeline, off the runway of that company that you're not going to get back. It's really important that you foster an amount of respect with one another, even if it's frustrating and hard at times to hold that with each other. These are relationships just as much as you might have one at home or with your family. These are people that are going to hold grudges at times. These are people who are going to be happy and supportive of you at times. These are people that, as long as you're working together and, showing them some respect, they're going to show you respect back. And I've seen the good sides of this. I've seen in businesses, in one of the last startups that I worked for, we had a crisis in the middle of a 5:00 Friday release. Poor timing, bad choices all around. But instead of, one person saying hey, this is just the web guy's problem, screw that guy, it's Friday, I'm going to go get drunk. we all came back into the office. We all dived on top of the problem together. We figured out from the mobile side what the issue was on the website, which helped them immensely and was able to save them a ton of time in being able to fix their issue. It's important not to point fingers. It's important to help. Independence. In startups, it's really important to kind of recognize your own self-wins. Startups are busy and they definitely don't have in place reward mechanisms usually. So there's a lot of incentive for you to kind of announce your own self-wins. Don't be shy with it either. It builds confidence in yourself. It allows you to know what you're good at, what you're not necessarily so good at. And it's a good time to kind of let the rest of the team know, hey, we conquered something major. And because it's not just you, just because like you solved your problem, that came at usually the hours of other people as well. So it's also a win for everybody. Take the time that you need away from a startup. You need the break. I can't express to you how much you need it. 80 hours a week for a long time is not sustainable. It's not good for you. It's not good for your health. It's not good for your family or your friends. They still need you as well. And you need them. Honestly, you need to spend the time and try to set aside that time. It's easier said than done in a lot of ways, but it's really important, I feel, to take that time to try to get away from the startup, reintroduce yourself to something different going on in the world. Exercise. Those are built-in hours where you're not in front of a computer screen, even if it's just walking. Leave your phone in your pocket. Try to spend an hour, if you can, a day. That's, doing something where you're moving and where your brain is not, necessarily focused on work. And then keep building things. Like I keep saying, regardless if it's technical, make things. It allows your brain to be creative in a lot of different ways, and it's going to allow you to find things that you might be passionate about that you had no idea. Moving on. So you've been at the startup, you're ready to move on to other things and kind of see what's new out there. Realize that startups aren't forever too. Startups outgrow their startup phase. Major funding brings on new faces, shifts priorities of the business, and sometimes the day-to-day of how the work gets done around there. Sometimes it's not for you at that point. Sometimes it's the business has changed into something that isn't, necessarily what you want to be doing. Recognize that a lot of startups fail. Most startups fail. And that this isn't, of any choice of your own. So sometimes you're forced to move along. My last startup, this is the exact position we're in. And then question if you've outgrown your startup. Are you still in it for the same reasons you were when you joined? Is the goal of the company and your goal the same? Are you still learning at the job? Or are you still earning at the job? Have you gotten raises? Are you financially being able to hit the milestones in your life that you want to be able to hit? Paying down debt, being able to afford a wedding, being able to go on vacations. Those are important things and that have value to people. So make sure that you're still earning enough money that you're able to do that. And then rinse and repeat or don't. What are your next goals? Is it to be more proficient in a particular area? Is there another startup that allows you to do that? Is there another role out there that allows you to chase doing that different thing? Or have your passions changed? My passion originally was just doing IoT. Now my passion is more of how can I bring IoT into improving people's lives. Healthcare has become a very passionate thing for me over the last job or so and going into what is hopefully my next job. And also ask if startups are right for you. While I've worked for startups, I've also worked for very large corporations as well. Bouncing back and forth isn't always a bad thing. And this time, what I'm looking at right now is actually going into a company that's existed for 30 plus years, but only has a development team of around 5 people. They have that job security that I'm kind of looking for. And also they have, a small team, which is like a startup, and they have products that you can own and really try to drive forward and really show and bring a lot of yourself to the table. So, working for startups isn't always, have to be the focus. You can have the love for them and you can help them and you can kind of dip in and out, as you see fit for your life and for your financial goals in your life as well. And also how you balance you know, grinding it out for a startup versus, working for a company that more or less appreciates, your 40 hours that you put in. And that's really it. So this was just kind of an overview of kind of the things that I've gathered over the last 10 years that I wish when I was a junior, somebody would have told me about essentially, or said to me like, hey, this is how startups act. And, these are a few of the things you should look out for. And this is how you should interact and, live with your team that you're going to be spending a lot of time with over the next few years. And that's it. So I'm open for questions now. I think we have about 10 minutes or so here on stream. And then I have an obligation for my face to be somewhere else on the web. But I will be answering questions for the duration of the evening over on Discord as well. And I believe that Lee will probably send out a link to that to those who want it.
Yeah, 100%. So awesome presentation, Steve. That was great.
Thank you.
I just want to throw out that we missed your introduction because of a small snafu on my part. So if you can just tell everybody who you are and what you do real quick, and where
Sure.
they can find you on the internet.
Cool. So you won't really find me on the internet anywhere other than my secret Twitch handle or my secret Twitch and Twitter handle, which I'm not going to share here today. But I'm Steve Jabs. I have around 10 years of startup experience here in the Orlando area, as specifically an iOS engineer. I've worked for about 3 startups in the Orlando area and 1 in California.
Cool. So I've got a couple of questions here that I was kind of jotting down while we were talking.
Cool.
So first of all, how prevalent is it to see like junior-ish or maybe early career developers at startups? It kind of seemed like while you were talking, they may expect a lot of like 10x Rockstar Ninja developers out there. So how likely are you to see, what experience level?
So I think that I hit on this a little bit earlier in the presentation, but I think like when you're looking, unless you're starting your own startup, that's really, I think, the only time that maybe a junior engineer is going to get in on like that founding level. But, once you pass, certain gates of funding, it really opens up a lot of opportunities for a company. So, for example, once you go through your Series A, that's really going to be the first growing point for a team. That's where you have product in the market. You have investors who believe in that product enough to want to put additional money into the company or a larger amount of money into a company. And this is where you start really kind of growing out your team and growing out that business and starting to build it kind of in the bulking phase, essentially. And that's really where juniors and I think mid-levels come on more heavily. It's not to say that you won't get a job applying for, a startup, because sometimes, money necessitates the skill level that they're going to get to. So there are opportunities for go-getters that are maybe at a junior or mid-level range, but I would say that they're fewer at that founding level and a lot more predominant at that post-Series A level.
Okay, yeah, that's a great point. As far as like the funding, is that something that you should ask about when you're applying or whenever you hear about a role?
Definitely. So you are essentially, I would look at when you're joining a startup, like look at it as almost you're getting married to somebody. You don't necessarily want to be like getting into a relationship with a person that, is far into debt, doesn't have a very likely good outcome, in a few months. Like, it's one of those things that might be fun. You might have a good time, but 3-6 months down the road, those things are going to show up heavy. So asking, what kind of runway does this company have? Like how, like if you receive no more funding today and you didn't earn another dollar from the product that you put on the market, how long can you pay people essentially? Asking about the runway at a startup is totally fine question to ask. And if they're not willing to answer it, again, you're right back to, is this a place that I'm really sure I want to work?
Awesome. So that kind of leads into job security. So I know startups can be pretty volatile. So you kind of touched on a little bit with the runway, but is it pretty reasonable to expect that, things could go under at any moment, or is that kind of what you're
I
asking
wouldn't.
whenever you're asking about funding?
There's always going to be warning signs. There's always going to be things that you will notice that things aren't looking great. The startup that I am at now, our last day was basically last Friday, because there's just no money left for the business. We didn't go to a Series B. We didn't get through a Series B. So it's one of those situations where, because there was no additional money put into the company, there's no additional runway. You have to make smart choices about how you take care of your customers and how you spend down the company. But there were warning signs along the way, and we had a CEO that was very communicative of those. He was letting us know, hey, this isn't looking good. There's a lot to be said for a CEO who's willing to do that too. I've seen both sides of it. I've seen CEOs who aren't willing to warn their companies about the bad times that are coming because they're worried that people might leave. I've said for a long time, let those people leave. They have every right to protect themselves and to protect their families and to protect their own self-interest. A CEO who has confidence in his team will have a lot of confidence back in them. And sometimes things just don't work out the way that you want them to. But it's very rarely overnight. And if it is overnight, it's because you were just misled and unfortunately lied to.
Yeah, that kind of you mentioned the CEO kind of being afraid to work the team or communicate with the team. What about like crunch periods with the startup versus like maybe the startup culture you maybe see on TV where people are eating cereal at lunchtime and drinking beer and stuff? There's kind of two sides of that coin. So can you speak to how much work you're actually doing at a startup?
Yeah. So like I said, I think every startup's a little bit different. I've worked at startups where we've put in months of 70, 80-hour weeks where we were in the office 6, 7 days a week, grinding on things, trying to get it out the door. I've worked at startups where, like I said, over 40 hours, they're almost nudging you, asking you like, hey, is there something wrong? Like, we don't expect like you to be putting in this many hours. Like, is everything okay? Like, or do you need help with something? So it's a feeling out process. Crunch time is real at startups though, because sometimes necessity means getting a product out the door 4 weeks faster than what you thought, or to get access to an investment opportunity. It might mean that you have to grind this side project out for somebody, or to close a contract. It means that you've got to put together this sales out for somebody essentially. I've kind of seen it all. I've seen it successful in some cases, in other cases, not so much.
Okay. I know we're running out of time, so last question. What about remote work? Is that something that you can see at an early stage startup, or is that kind of an impossibility when the company is that small and that volatile?
I think it depends on the idea and the problem you're solving. So remote is something that I'm actually a pretty big proponent of. I have pushed for it at a lot of my jobs. And at my last one, I was 100% remote, other than I was making trips out every kind of couple of months to go visit the team and work with a few members of the team one-on-one. There's something to be said for sitting side by side with somebody. You're going to learn a lot faster. Sometimes debugging is really only done really well side by side, especially if you're in like an IoT or hardware space. It's not easy unless you have like an engineer, a mobile engineer who's comfortable flashing and basically putting firmware onto their own boards and onto their own devices. If you set up the proper mechanisms as a company, I think it makes it a little bit easier. But 100% remote out of the gate for some startups just won't work.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, it's coming up on 8 o'clock. So, Steve, thanks
Cool.
again for joining us and giving this awesome presentation over the live stream. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So, if you guys want to keep asking Steve questions or you have anything you want to connect with Steve over, you can jump into the Discord channel. I'll be sharing that on Slack, or some of you are probably already in there. So, please check out that and bug Steve with all your questions.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks again.